Hazel Tindall and welcome to Shetland Wool Week 2021, virtual again. So I'm going to do basics and belts because I think that a lot of people might be interested in some of the basic stuff that you need for knitting, and there's always a lot of curiosity about macking belts, knitting belts. So we'll get on to the belts later, but for the start I'm just going to be working without a belt. So the first thing I'm going to do is a cast on. Now my go-to cast on is a long tail. So figuring out how much yarn you need for the tail, this is yarn I don't use a lot, but I would guess that's probably 15 stitches that you would get from that length. On jumper weight yarn I usually reckon about 30. So I always start with a slip knot, just round my finger and pull it through, and that goes on the needle. I always knit with the yarn in my right hand for one colour, and I tension it just by putting it between the little finger and the ring finger, turn my hand over and it comes up over this finger. And on the left hand I just use my thumb to go around the yarn, and then you've got a space for the needle to go into, and that's your second stitch done. And again you go into that loop and pull it tight, and that's how you do a long tail cast on. Now you can do it with everything in the left hand, and I'm not very good at that, but I'll have a go. But I just think that if you have one yarn in your right hand and the other one in the left, you're pulling them against each other, and so you get your tension more easily. So everything in the left hand, the yarn is over the finger, and the thumb is going into the middle again. So you're ready to go again. If I practiced, I would get faster. So this is the long tail cast on. Now sometimes if you haven't calculated how much you need for the tail and you have an awful lot of stitches and you run out of tail, you don't have to take it off and undo it all again. You can go for the other end of the ball and just, I would let the two ends hang down and just carry on and deal with the ends afterwards. Now when your piece of knitting is finished, you would just twist these ends and weave them in up the back of the knitting, and at the end, when it's finished, you'll not really notice that you've joined it in there, but it's a lot easier than undoing and starting again. But it is useful to get it right first time. So you could see this is where I've put in the new one. So if these are woven into the back of the knitting, you're not really going to see it. And the other thing with a long tail, you have to decide, is this the right side or is this the right side? Some days I think this is the right side, and some days I think this is the right side. So you get a slightly different edge. Another way of casting on, which is quite good for lace, is to use the two needle method. And again, I start with a slip knot and get that onto the left needle and pull it tight. And with this, you don't need a long end. And you just go into the stitch on your left needle and knit it, and then slip the new stitch onto the left needle, and then you knit again and slip the new one on and knit. And this is a good edge for lace. And I don't know if you can see this, maybe if I knit a row it'll be better. So this gives a more open edge. It's not very easy to see here, but you can see it gives a kind of a loopy edge. It's a less dense edge than the long tail. And now I'm going to show you some provisional cast-ons. Why would you do a provisional cast-on? Well, in the corner of a shawl is knitted. It starts with this long edge, this long narrow bit that goes all the way around. So you start here with a provisional cast on, which means that you have live stitches that you can join on to. So when you've got all the way around here, you've got the stitches that you've finished knitting, and then you've got live stitches from the cast on. So that's one place. And another place that I used a provisional cast on was when I was knitting this. Then this was knitted up the way, and to get stitches for the top of the arms, I used a provisional cast on along here. And then I picked up these live stitches to make this edging all the way around here. Provisional cast-ons are written into quite a lot of patterns. If I was doing a top-down yoke jumper, which I have no intention of doing, but a lot of people like to do them, I would start with a provisional cast on at the colour work, and then I would have an option to adjust the neck after I'd finished knitting everything else. It's a good way of starting when you don't quite know how you want to finish it off, if you see what I mean. So the easiest way is to do a little bit on waste yarn. This is just yarn that's left over from something else. So I've cast on and I've knit a couple of rows. And the next thing I would do is knit in a piece of cotton or something strong across this row, and this would be a separator between the waste yarn and the piece that I'm going to knit, the main colour. So this is just, you don't need to fasten it on, you just leave it hanging. If you use cotton, it means that it'll not stick to your yarn, so it should pull out quite easily. Just make sure that it's long enough. So that's the separator knitted in. And then you're ready to start with your main colour, which would be this one. and then you just knit. Like, sometimes I leave a longer end here, and then it's useful for when you do pick up your stitches. Now that's a bit loose, but you can just pull it tighter. And you just knit along this row. And this is you ready to start your main piece of knitting. And you can keep the waste yarn and the separator row, you can keep them attached while you do whatever you're going to do next, and you just keep going with that piece of knitting. And I did a little bit just to show you what the next step would be. So this is the waste yarn, and this is the row that I knitted in, and then I've done a few rows up above and just cast it off. So it's always safer to pick up your stitches before you pull out that yarn. And I use a thin needle for this. And what you're looking for are these little bumps along here. So you just go into each one. And these are going to be your live stitches that you do something with. You might knit onto them, or you might graft them Kitchener stitch to something else. So it takes a little bit of time, but it's worth catching these stitches before you pull out the cotton. And you'll pick up one less than you actually cast on, because you're picking up the little bumps in the space between the stitches. You're not picking up. So what you're picking up is between these two stitches. So you'll pick up one less. So if you cast on 20, you'll pick up 19. And then the next step is to pull this cotton out. Oops, well, sometimes it breaks, but you just start at the opposite end. I think this has been well used. And if it's broken like that, you have to pull it. You have to find an end. You can see the waste bit has started to come off. It's actually easier to pull the thread out before you pick up the stitches, but some people are not comfortable with having to pick up the live stitches, so I thought I would show you the safe way. So that's the stitches all ready for their next journey. So whatever that would be, that's the stitches picked up and ready to go. Another way of doing a provisional cast on is with a crochet hook, and you make a crochet chain. So I use a big hook and crochet quite loosely. So I start with a slip knot and get it on the hook. Not too tight, because then it gets awkward. And then I'm just going to crochet a long chain and keeping it really loose. And I usually crochet a bit longer than I'm actually going to need. And then fasten it off. And just pull it through. So this is the crochet chain, and I hope hope you can see the little bumps that have come along here. So if I give it a pull, you'll see like knit stitches at that side, and we've got little bumps here. So I'm going to use a thin needle. This is a really thin one, to pick up these bumps. And I don't care whether I get every one or not. If they're too tight, you can't get into them, because this is going to become undone. So when you get it on the needle, you should see that this is a chain along here. And then you just get the right size needle. Make sure you've picked up as many as you need, and then you get your needle and just start knitting. And if I do another row on the right size needles, then I can show you what happens. Might have to do another 2 rows. So I'll just cast this off so that I don't have live stitches at both sides. So this is where you've cast on with the crochet, and again you need to pick up the stitches before you undo the crochet. So you start with the bumps just the same as you did with the waste yarn. And so you and again you'll have one less stitch than you started with, and when you get them all up, and I think that's another one there, then you undo the crochet. So this was where I fastened it off, I think, should be. This is where I wish I had the eyes of an 18-year-old. And when you get it right, when you've undone it, you just pull the crochet out, and I think that's one I've missed. And again, I crochet with cotton so that it wouldn't stick to the wool. So that's, oh yes, I missed picking one up there, that's why it got stuck, but it's there. So that's your stitches all ready to go again. So another way of, it's just cutting out a step, is to actually crochet straight onto a knitting needle. So again, I'll start with a slip knot, and I'll do a few chain before I go to the needle. And that gives me something to hold on to. So I keep hold of the end of the crochet just to keep it under control. And then I find to do this, I like the yarn in my right hand, and I just go behind the needle and over the hook. And once you get going, you do get a rhythm to this. But I haven't found a way to do it with my left hand, because it seems to wrap around the needle too much. And this just saves you having to look for the bumps at the back of the crochet chain. And then when I've finished, I would just do 1 or 2 more chain. And then just pull it to fasten it off. And then you're all ready to knit. I think that's a different size needle, but never fear. So you just leave a decent end. It can be useful for when you're starting off from your provisional cast on to have a longer end. So you just knit across. And this is you ready to start whatever it is you're going to do. And this would be the way I usually start a provisional cast on. I'll just do another row. And I'll just cast this bit off now, so we don't have 2 lots of stitches to end up bother with. And I should have mentioned that the easiest way to cast off is just to knit. So you get 2 on your right needle, and then you just piggyback one over the other. You have to watch that you don't get it too tight. But it's the most used way of casting off, I think. Get rid of that, and then you've got your crochet cast on here, and you just need to pick up your stitches using a thin needle. It's always more useful to pick up with a thinner needle. As long as you remember to switch to the right size when you get going. think I've actually split the yarn here. I've only knit it into half the thickness. And so that's the stitches picked up, and then you go to the end of your crochet and you undo this end, and once you get the yarn at the right place you can just undo this chain and your stitches are all on the needle. Except there's one there that I would just catch, and this is where I split the yarn, but that's a provisional cast on all ready to go. So seeing as we're doing basics, I've got a little piece here with quite a lot of mistakes in it. And the first one that I can see is 3 stitches along, where I've only knitted into one strand of the yarn. So we'll knit along till we get there. And then I'm just going to go into the row below and catch the missing thread there. So that's that one. And then we'll have a look for the next mistakes. Well, I put a few in here. Now you can see that there's something not quite right there, but it's kind of hard to see what's wrong. So if you look at the wrong side, then you can see, yeah, there's something going on there with this stitch here. But sometimes if you hold it up to the light, if you get you can maybe see here. What's happened is I've knit it into the stitch below, so I've got 2 rows of yarn going into one stitch. So if I knit till I get there, which is just one more stitch, and then I'm just going to drop this one down. And sometimes with sticky Shetland yarn you have to persuade it to go down. And so this is where I've managed to knit into the row below. So I'm just teasing it apart. And then I'll use a crochet hook. Now I usually like to use a hook that's smaller than the needle size. So I just get that hook in and work the stitch back up. And you shouldn't be able to see it. And then slip it onto the needle, and if you give it a pull, that should make it invisible. And a few more stitches, and suddenly for some strange reason I've decided to do a purl stitch there, but I didn't mean to, so I'm going to get rid of that one. So again I'll just slip this down to where the mistake is. So that's the one that I don't want facing that way. So again, I just go in with a crochet hook. This is the last correct one. And work the way up. It's a lot quicker than ripping it back. Or as we would say in Shetland, spread. Nobody wants to spread their marking. And you can see using the hook, you can't really see where I've been. And then there's a few more. So here I've managed to do a yarn over and I've got an extra stitch. Now that isn't the best thing to happen, especially on thicker yarn. So we'll do the best we can to hide it, but it's not as easy. If it doesn't work, you'll probably have to go back. But I'm just going to undo until I get to this hole. And then I'll knit a few more. So you can see you've got these really loose stitches here. So you have to work them along to try and take up that slack in the neighbours. And so you might have to go along too, just gently. So you're making the neighbouring stitches a little bit bigger, and you just work that yarn along. And then you go to the other side and do it there too. And I think if you took a bit of time, you can see that it would be quicker than ripping back. And the knitter on the galloping horse probably wouldn't notice it, which is my sort of test. And then I did a little bit of garter stitch to show you how to fix something that's gone wrong in garter stitch. And I've just noticed something that I hadn't noticed before. Here I've dropped a stitch, but further down here I've missed a strand of yarn. So to fix that, I'm just going to go right down, and this is where the stitch has split. And now you can do this with a crochet hook again, although this time you come in behind the stitch so that you get a purl bump. And then the next row would be knit, so you can go from the front with a hook. And now I would take the hook out and put it in, and then catch the thread for the purl bump, and then this would be a knit row. So you come in from the front, and then here I would go behind, take the stitch above the thread and then go like that, and then the rest of the way up was knit, which is always easier. Now this is where I had a dropped stitch, so it means that above the drop bit it's got a little bit tighter. But because it was only a couple of rows, then I think you're not going to notice. So you can't really see which stitch it was. And then here again I've managed to increase the stitch numbers. I've done a yarn over, so again I'm just going to drop down and get rid of it. So that's really quite a big gap, but you should be able to, I don't recommend making all these extra holes, but sometimes it happens if you're not paying attention or if you're new to knitting. So I would just move this yarn along so you're actually making the neighbours a bit bigger. And if you do that along maybe 2 or 3 stitches at both sides, then it can hide it. Just this one. And that pretty much hides the mistakes. It's not perfect, and I put all the mistakes at this half. But that's really how to fix basic mistakes. Well, like a lot of Shetlanders, I like to use a knitting belt, or a mackin belt we call them here. So this is my old one that's probably 50 odd years old. So the horsehair that's in the middle has got a bit more brittle, so I sometimes have to move it. And it's worn at the right hand side. And where you wear it depends on the length of needles and just however you can get a comfortable angle. And before I begin, I'll show you some other belts. This is a new belt, and you can see that it's quite stiff and rigid, so you kind of have to prime it before you use it. So I usually bend it round a bit, and some people will wear them even if they're not knitting, so that it gradually bends to the shape of their body. This one has a lot fewer holes than mine. And this one, this is my mother's belt, so it's even older. And sometimes I do a knitting belt class, and I need extensions to the length of the belt, because this is a really short belt. So this is a way of extending your belt length, just a length of crochet, and the hook just goes into the crochet when you put it on. And this is another way of extending. If you buy a belt and it's not big enough, I bought extra belts from a charity shop, really narrow ones, so you can extend your knitting belt length. This one has a very small pad and very stiff. This one can hardly bend. I think this was made for a child and it's not been used. So this one's very stiff, and really I would have a struggle getting a big needle into that. So those are the belts, and this belt has got some holes that have been more stretched than others, so this one will take this needle. And this is how I would knit with a belt. You get the angle so that your elbow is roughly 90 degrees, and that's what I find comfortable. And this gives the freedom that you don't need to hold on to this needle rigidly. So all you do is hold on to this left needle, and then you start knitting. And your hand is just gently leaning on this. And very often my elbow is leaning on the belt. And you just have to keep moving everything until it's comfortable. So that's what I would use a belt. So some days I might want it lower, some days I might want it higher. It just depends how I'm feeling that day and how long the needles are. But this side can get quite heavy as it grows. So I usually like to put a piece of cotton I would normally have put it in much earlier than this. So I'm just threading it loosely through the cast on edge, and this gives, it's like a tail for the knitting. And I'll join this in a circle. And then I can pull this and wrap it round the belt, and that takes the weight off the left hand. And just a couple of turns, and it's just enough that you can tighten it as your knitting gets longer. And this is actually, I think, more important than having a belt. If you don't have a belt, you can feel the benefits of using the string. It's taking all the weight off this hand, and if you get it tight enough, it elongates the stitch that you're going to knit into, and so your knitting can get a bit faster. So even if you don't have a belt, a string is a really good idea, but of course it's not of any help if you're using a circular needle. And if you want to knit in the round with long double pointed needles and a belt, you're really knitting an oblong. You go along this side and then this side. This is a piece that I have just for demonstrating. It's had its string attached down here, and I've actually used it to show that you can cut your knitting and nothing bad will happen. So when you're knitting, when the knitting gets a bit longer, I usually put it under my arm. And I always hold the yarn in my left hand, the pattern colour, the one that's going to make the shape. And I find that to tension it, it needs to come out of that joint. If it's down here, it's too loose. But if it comes just out there, it works fine. And this hand is just tensioned as I did earlier. So you make sure that the stitches here are fairly tight as you turn the corner, and I'm just going to knit any old rubbish here because the pattern is long gone. Then when you get to the end, it gets a bit tricky, but you just turn it round, and if possible I like to keep this yarn on this finger. And another way of getting it tight where the two needles meet is to have this one coming underneath, and that brings the two stitches a lot closer together. It takes away the gap. So if you find that you are getting gaps, then this is a way to fix it. And then as soon as you get on a bit, you just move that needle behind. And all the time I'm knitting with the 3 needles, I'm just ignoring this one, so it's not going to go anywhere. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've learned a little something. When we made 50 Tips from Shetland Knitters, a DVD which is available from Jamieson and Smith, we had to keep everything quite tight because there was so much information that went into that. So it's been nice today to spend a little bit more time showing you the steps, especially for the provisional cast-ons, which is becoming more popular, it seems. If you want to follow what I'm up to, you can find me on Instagram. It's Hazel_Tindall_, and I usually post every Friday for Fair Isle Friday and occasionally through the week. Thank you.